Hey guys, Olly Richards here, and today I've got something really cool for you. This is going to be a conversation that you're going to love if you just enjoy geeking out about languages, having kind of long, rambling, in-depth conversations about all things language learning. It's recorded a couple of months ago in the height of the pandemic, but only just getting to release it now because that's the schedule I work to these days. I'm talking with Lamont from a YouTube channel called Days of French and Swedish, and we'll link that below. I've been watching Lamont for some time. He thinks very deeply about languages. I like the way he thinks about languages, asks questions, interviews people on his channel. So I wanted to get him on for a chat. Lots of things you're going to learn, right? What are you going to learn in this conversation? Is it a disadvantage to learn languages if you're a latecomer? If you're getting late to the game of language learning? What is comprehensible input, and does it matter? The one thing that governs your success and failure with languages, and it's got nothing to do with language learning. What are first world problems when it comes to language learning? The most dangerous development in all of language learning in recent years. And what is the point of people like me doing YouTube language projects where I go off and learn languages for 3 months and try and document all of it? What is the point? All of these things we're going to cover in this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So without any further ado, all right, so I'm here with Lamont from the curiously titled Days of French and Swedish. How's it going?
Yeah, good. I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm well, thanks. Good to talk to you. We're actually meeting for the first time, so often with these discussions, it's normal to have a bit of a sort of pre-chat, if you like. But we decided to just kind of dive straight in and see where it takes us. So maybe to start with, could you maybe just tell us where Days of French and Swedish comes from? What's that all about?
Well, I named the channel maybe 9 months ago or something. I renamed it, and I was at the time studying French and Swedish, so it wasn't too much of a stretch, but it was kind of a reference to a number of things. I sort of wanted it to sound a bit like the movie Days of Wine and Roses, just because I think it's a cool movie title. And I wanted to call it like Days of French and Roses, but that didn't work because actually my Swedish is better than my French. So, and I just thought I liked the idea of including days in there because if you think about it, language is learned in days in terms of like, okay, it might take you like 3 years to get to a certain point, but that's 3 years of studying every day. Or of studying in days. If you never put in the days, then you don't get the result at the end of 3 years.
Yeah.
So that was, I just sort of thought it sounded good. Days of French and Swedish. It just had a nice ring to it, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, it absolutely does, and it caught my attention. Although I did assume that you were learning French and Swedish, which I guess it would have been accurate at one point. But then I guess the question is, what happens in a couple of years from now when you're learning Farsi and Turkish?
It doesn't matter actually, because I one of my most watched videos was like 6 weeks ago or something when I announced that I am putting French aside because I was unhappy with my level in either language. So I've just gone all in on Swedish. So a lot of people made the obvious comment that is it just called Days of Swedish now, but I don't know. In my mind, these for me are still the days of my language learning, which started with French and Swedish. So
yeah, well, I mean, this is it's kind of a nice way in here because we all start these kind of YouTube channels and podcasts through a passion of some kind, don't we? And I want to ask you about that, but maybe give us the Cliff Notes version of you first before we get into this. What's your background with languages, and how did you end up starting a YouTube channel and talking about languages?
My background with languages is that 3.5 years ago, I just sort of thought I would start learning some Swedish. It's kind of a boring story as to why, and I've told it on my channel before. I don't know if you want to hear it, but
well, for the benefit of people who are hearing you for the first time, give us the potted version.
Yeah. So there was a Finnish girl staying with us here, like in our house, my wife and I, and she stayed with us actually for quite a while. In the end, she like went to New Zealand for a couple of months, but then she came back and stayed with us again, and it ended up being quite like sort of 3 weeks in total, and we barely knew her, so it felt like quite a while. But she was great. We really enjoyed having her. And on her way to the airport, she said, like, well, I stayed with you. You'll have to come and stay with me in Helsinki. And we sort of said, yeah, like, let's make it happen. And I just thought, well, if we're going to go to Scandinavia and spend all that money and everything, I'm going to want to learn one of the languages. And Swedish just seemed to make the most sense. Even though she was Finnish, we were planning on going to Denmark and Sweden and Finland. And Swedish is a second official language of Finland. It's mutually understandable in Norway. And then Sweden itself has the biggest population. So I just started with Swedish. And it's kind of lucky I did, because it's definitely easier than Finnish, and it's easier than Danish as well. So, but at the time, I just thought it was like, I'm not going to continue this. I'm just going to kind of see how it goes. And something about it, I think you actually, Ollie, and Benny Lewis were some of the first people I kind of discovered in terms of the methodology of learning a language and how to actually do it in a non-school book kind of textbook kind of way. So I actually became really interested in this, what I would call more modern approach to language learning. Like Benny's got his thing of just like speak early and speak a lot. And Ollie, you have your stories. And I was just really interested in that, more so than I was in Swedish, but Swedish was the vehicle that I was using to explore that. So that's, yeah. And then a year later, I just started learning French because, you know, a year is about where Swedish starts getting hard. Right. And I sort of thought I was pretty cool, and I would just start learning another language because I thought I had Swedish pretty down pat, which I didn't at all. So yeah, that's pretty much my background of languages.
And then what led to the YouTube channel?
What led to the YouTube channel was, I think I actually started recording I also do like foreign series reviews, so like non-English language series, because everyone does reviews of English language series, but very few people talk about stuff that's not in English. So I started doing that. And I also, since I was so kind of interested in language learning as well, I just mixed a few of those videos in there as well. And it ended up that I became sort of equally passionate about both, but also the language videos kind of got a lot more traction and a lot more attention and stuff. So that's kind of where my channel came from, really.
Yeah, and I guess the where I noticed you from was you know how you kind of have various people on your radar, you know, you kind of, and then you see snippets of them, and then there comes a point with it's always like that with me anyway. I'm kind of aware of people because they pop up in your YouTube feed, and you see snippets here and there. But then there's usually one moment, like one video or something, where you actually kind of spend a bit of time actually properly listening to something that somebody's saying, and then that kind of sometimes can open a floodgate. And then, you know, opens your eyes to what they're really talking about. And I think in your case, what caught my attention was just the way that you're very articulate in talking about languages, and you kind of take you obviously think quite deeply about the different topics, different areas of language learning. And I really kind of appreciated that because, well, that's always what most interested me, you know. So I thought that's why I thought it would be cool to have you on for a discussion. So thanks for giving us that background. That's super interesting. So you were actually a kind of relative latecomer to the language thing then.
Oh, very, very latecomer. Yeah. I mean, I did German at school, like a lot of people. I did a language at school, and I actually did it for quite a long time, like for 4 years. So from what we call year 9 through to when I finished in year 12. But I was just such a horrible student, not talented, just not dedicated at all. And I remember us going through stuff in year 12 that we should have been going through in year 9. So I just barely scraped through passing the year 12 exam.
familiar story for many people, I think.
Yeah, it's like, but no, I want to say that actually in my case, it wasn't to do with the way languages were taught or the teacher or anything. All of that was actually pretty good by school standards. The teacher was great, but I just had no application to any subject really at school except music. But so, yeah, it was my fault.
So that's interesting for me because, I mean, you mentioned me and Benny. I mean, both Benny and I kind of grew up with languages in adulthood. You know, we didn't have languages around as kids, but we both kind of started learning languages around the same time, you know, kind of 19, 20, that kind of, you know, university age. And so what do you, from your perspective then, as a relative latecomer, but someone who's been, you know, now kind of had a crash course in the world of languages and also the kind of what people call the online polyglot, which I hate passionately as a term, but whatever, that's what people call it. What are some of the big issues that you see in this whole world, or the big kind of areas that matter? Where should discussions about languages be framed?
So you don't mean big issues like big problems?
No, I mean just the kind of,
what are the big topics?
Yeah, what are the things that what are the things that people should be thinking about?
I think that people should most be thinking about motivation and how to get yourself to do something that isn't necessarily what you would naturally do. So you can change quite quickly, but for a lot of people, the story of their life is like on a weekend, they'll get up, have coffee, eat something unhealthy perhaps, and then sort of sit around and waste a lot of the morning. Like I think that's a fairly common story for anyone between about 19 and 50, really, possibly even older. And that was definitely the story. I did nothing for my 20s, like nothing that involved any kind of hard work. I just did like the bare minimum to survive. And it's like I kind of have this tagline that's like, we know what works for language learning. Like if you want to learn a language, because I feel like everyone has at some point said, I would like to learn a language. We know what works. Like there are people out there who have almost distilled it down to like, this is what we know works. But it's not always fun. It's kind of, you can make it fun, like through, you know, short stories or little games or whatever. You can do things that make it more interesting. But to the person who has not involved themselves in language learning at all, the easiest, most fun thing to do is to go on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever. And so I think that what we should be talking about more is like, okay, what works is comprehensible input. How do we first get to the stage where we make input comprehensible? And then how do we keep doing that even when it is not what we would naturally want to do?
Sure. So I guess it's like, you know, someone could explain to me how to create a rocket that gets to the moon, but that's not, you know, to say I'll be able to follow the instructions and actually do it, or be able to afford the pieces and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, more like let's say like I'm not as healthy as I would want to be, right? I know what a healthy person does. Like a healthy person eats less non-nutritious food, eats more good food, eats more fruit and veg, and does more exercise. And does all
those things consistently.
Yeah.
Right. And that's actually this is where I always fall down. Like I'll have a couple of really great weeks, you know, talking about you know, health and nutrition and stuff like that. I'll have a couple of great weeks, but then I just don't stay consistent, and that's what torpedoes my all my goals. And I was thinking that was a fairly good analogy with language learning in the sense of what you brought up, which is like it's one thing to know what works, it's another thing to actually be able to execute on that, but also to have the right frame of mind to be able to do all that. I guess one of the specific things where I've kind of always collided with that specific problem is in learning Chinese characters, because I've had many attempts to learn Chinese characters over the years through in Japanese and also in Cantonese, and I could tell you exactly what works. I know what works because I've done it on a small scale. It bores me to tears, and I don't want to do it, and so I've never done it. And so it's a kind of really clear example, very very tangible example for me of how knowing what works doesn't make it easy.
Yeah.
And so I guess so this kind of circles back to what you were saying earlier, right, about motivation, because everything, if we ask the question like, okay, what is the one thing without which everything else fails? And it is motivation, right? Because if you're not motivated, then I could give you all the best tricks in the world, but you won't use them. So what? It's interesting what you said about motivation. So the example you gave about the kind of Saturday morning, donuts and TV and stuff like that, rather than just sitting there, and it's a great example because just like you would, let's say you wanted to get fit. Okay, on that Saturday morning, the first thing you might want to do is just go for a run first thing in the morning, and then the challenge then is to do that and then to keep it up week after week after week. And so with language learning, I guess the equivalent would be, well, on a Saturday morning, you schedule yourself some time to work on your languages, and then you actually make yourself do it. So how do you think about that? This question of motivation, then, of actually talking to people about motivation and I mean, can you manufacture motivation? What would you say to someone who knows what to do, but still falls into all those traps on a Saturday morning, like you were saying?
I guess so. I would try to avoid describing it as like, oh, okay, instead of eating donuts and watching TV, you've just got to sit down and do it, because it's that might work twice. Like, I think there's some expression that's something like discipline will only get you so far, and it's really more. It's not so much about discipline, but about like routines, and because once you do something, even just a couple of times, it actually becomes more normal to do that thing than to not do that thing. Like for today, I mean, it's a bit of a sort of a first world problem for me, in that my Swedish is of a good enough level that a lot of activities are interesting to me because I understand quite a lot. But today I've done like close to 4 hours of Swedish.
Wow.
And that wasn't like, I mean, okay, I didn't have a lot to do today. I get that people have work and everything, but that wasn't like I got up and went, right, I have to do Swedish. That was like I got up and listened to my audiobook that is like reading now. Like instead of reading in English, I have an audiobook or I read in Swedish. And then I have conversations, which are also interesting. So the question is how to make something interesting enough to you that you will make it into a routine. And for me, I was lucky in that, even though I wouldn't say like from a pure language learning perspective, this is the best idea, but I kind of followed Benny's advice to just go all in on speaking right away. And I had these extremely uncomfortable conversations, but at the same time, they were motivating enough for me that it actually felt quite strange to not have conversations in Swedish. After a little while, even though I was extremely bad at it, it became so normal to speak this kind of awful, broken Swedish that it wasn't uncomfortable any longer. So it felt weirder not to do it. And I think most people everyone actually needs to find their thing that's like, what can you do for long enough that it will feel odd not to do that thing.
Yeah, motivation is a real tricky one, because you've got so many different. You can pass it out into so many different categories. I often think about my kind of early days of language learning, and it was so simple and straightforward because I just had unstoppable limitless motivation to learn.
Yeah.
When I was 20,
Yeah.
21, like I was just discovering the world for the first time, having that feeling of meeting new people and communicating with them, and like my life was all I wanted to do all day every day was learn languages so I could talk to people and meet people. And I was in that situation as well, where I would be meeting people and had that opportunity to speak and communicate. So with that order of motivation in place, nothing else mattered. It didn't matter what activities I did, because if you're that motivated, you're gonna whatever you do, you're gonna bring to it the kind of passion and drive that's gonna just drive you forward, and you're going to end up learning the language. It's kind of crazily simple and straightforward, really, how that works. But then as time's gone on, and I guess the kind of the novelty of learning new languages has kind of worn off a little bit, and I'm also not. It's also more of an intellectual pursuit for me now, because I'm kind of installed in one place here in an English speaking country. If I'm to learn a language, it's not because I need it or I'm going to use it much. It's just almost just for the sake of doing it. Yeah. And then I went without that kind of huge driving motivation that I talked about just a second ago. Then you kind of into this territory of what you were talking about, which is all right. I don't have this just unstoppable motivation. So given that I don't have that unstoppable motivation, what's the next rung down the ladder? And that's kind of, okay, well, let's find materials and activities that we would consider fun and enjoyable so we can kind of replace them. But already then you're kind of you've then got to summon up the motivation to do it. And you've got to try to create these routines. I mean, there's more of a kind of effort involved. And I think for most people, they're in that kind of situation. They don't have this unlimited, boundless motivation. They don't have the environment around them that's pressuring them to learn. It is a kind of an existential thing that they're learning. So if you're a person who doesn't have practice or training at being disciplined and creating new habits, then it's the number one thing you're up against. Before you even get to language problems, remembering verb conjugations, gender of nouns, prepositions, all that stuff, like that all that stuff. I always say that there's no language problem that can't be solved through just consistent work. Nothing is that difficult. But what is really hard for most people is just that basic skill of just saying, right, I decide that I'm gonna learn this thing now, and I'm gonna turn up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning, whether I feel like it or not. And where I always fail is that whether I feel like it or not, because I usually don't feel like it, and therefore I don't do it. I think, like you say, first world problems, too comfortable, all of that stuff. And then,
sorry, just to clarify, I actually meant that I was kind of borrowing a phrase that you used some months back, and I'm sure you don't even remember, but a friend of yours who speaks very high level Cantonese, as far as I understand it, said that he has problems finding the Cantonese that's in the right accent or something, and you said, yeah, but that's like first world problems, in that it's like a problem that occurs very high up the ladder. And so that's what I was describing my Swedish as, in that I know most people can't just go and listen to audiobooks and watch Netflix without subtitles and stuff. Like that's a problem that occurs at a B1, B2, or even C1 kind of level.
Yeah.
So that's, but there, of course, we do both exist also in first world problems, in that, like, too much Wi-Fi access and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that thing of, just if you just consider the smartphone, like I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that the existence of smartphones could be responsible for huge amounts of failed potential in language learning, just because of the degree of distraction. I've talked about this a couple of times. I remember talking about this with Luca a few years back, where we were saying that we both of us remember what it was like to learn languages pre-internet. And we both kind of felt that was actually a really valuable experience, because if you go on let's say you want to learn French these days, you could just end up in an endless rabbit hole on Google looking at all the different French courses and free podcasts, and you've got free stuff and cheap stuff and expensive stuff, like endless options. But back in the day when I was learning French, the only thing I could do to learn French was go to my local library, where they'd have like some old linguaphone course or something, or else go to the local, like, I was lucky I lived in London. I could go, there was the European bookshop, which used to be in Soho, and then they would have like maybe 5 or 6 like French grammar books, like 3 or 4 of which were from the 50s and just looked terrible, and like there were like 2 modern ones, and so those are the 2 books you get, and that's all you got. So you just use them, and that's all that's available to you. So you're just going to work your way through from beginning to end, and it's kind of very kind of blunt force approach, but it's far better to do that than to kind of be on some online course getting distracted by Instagram every 10 seconds and then nothing's going into any degree of depth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So sorry if I interrupted your train of thought there before.
No, thoughts are there to be interrupted.
I think the online, or my kind of thing that I've been working on for the last year or so is that actually I wrote an essay for italki about this that I got a runner-up. I didn't win. On the future of language learning, and I basically made the argument that they wanted to know the answer to the question, there's never been a better time to learn a language, and then expand. And I basically said, although yes, there has never been an easier time to access materials, there has also never been a more distracting time in the history of the world. So my argument was that high degree foreign language acquisition is there for the taking for anyone who can learn to mine the resources of the internet,
mine them appropriately, and in a
without
controlled
being
way.
distracted by it.
No, it reminds me of the of that, with Facebook. Originally when Zuckerberg started Facebook, he did it with good intentions. He wanted to well, actually, I think the original incarnation of Facebook wasn't such good intentions. That was to kind of spy on girls in the dorms and stuff like that. But when they started expanding, it was like, okay, well, let's connect the world, bring the world together. That's a cool aim, right? No one could have foreseen that it would have resulted in it would have turned into social media and the kind of death of civilization as we know it. So the fact that we're all connected. I mean, how awesome is it that we're talking like London to Sydney now. Instantly. I mean, it's just incredible. But then that's kind of one. It brings with it so many different issues, right? And so it's it comes down to that. However many resources you've got, you've still got to learn to be focused and efficient. And I don't like to think how I would have got on with languages. If the internet had been what it is now back in 2001, because I'm fairly easily distracted by stuff, and I have to go to quite extreme lengths to shut stuff off. So, but I did do. I mean, a lot of my early motivations to learn languages were around people, So when I learned Portuguese, for example, I was in Brazil with people, with friends, just speaking all the time, and in that kind of situation, but it's pure luxury, isn't it? Like that's nothing that constitutes useful advice because no one can actually do it.
No, well, that's true, but I guess this is something I'd like to start talking about a little bit more often. I think it's harder to talk about, and that's why I haven't done it as much as I would like to have yet. But things like starting from a very base level. So you were touching on this before, that like without motivation you have nothing. So learning to motivate yourself, but I don't think it's a huge stretch to say that a big part of Matt versus Japan's success, not necessarily with Japanese, but certainly with like his online presence and what he's done with Japanese since, and like the whole mass immersion approach and stuff. A big part of that, I think, is due to meditation, because when you have an online presence that's as popular as his is, it's even more easy. It's even easier to get distracted. Like even easier than it is for anyone else who just has their normal Facebook page and whatever. When you've got like people constantly like commenting on your videos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he meditates quite a lot, and he's quite sort of deep in on meditation. And I want to meditate more. I want to make it a habit of mine, because it really does just reset your whole level of normal to the point where you almost find like all this stuff a bit too much, and you want to switch it off naturally.
Have you heard about these dopamine fasts that people are doing?
I have heard about them, but I've not gotten into them yet. But one YouTuber I'm a very big fan of talks about them a bit.
Yeah. The idea I think is that you basically go on a fast of sorts, where you try to eliminate from your life anything that constitutes a kind of what would you call it, a trigger, so social media with its notifications, smartphone, anything on a smartphone, anything that gets you to any activity which would be associated with dopamine that's manufactured artificially. And it sounded like a really cool idea, and I looked into it, and I started to see a whole bunch of criticism on it, saying, "Oh, this is just a kind of hobby for the Silicon Valley rich kids and stuff like that." Another kind of classic first world problem. Too much dopamine, too much. So I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, that's. I also thought that about Matt as well, because he's very zen, and I'm a frustrated meditator myself. I really get huge amounts of value from meditation, and I've gone through periods of doing it quite often. Almost 10 years ago or so, I had issues with stress, and I discovered mindfulness meditation back then, and that saved my life in many ways. And the stuff that I've learned from that has been incredibly useful at various different points since, especially when I've been in difficult situations, being able to just kind of calm the noise and just dampen the flames on the fire a little bit. It's incredibly powerful. But I much like with my with the Chinese characters thing I was mentioning earlier, I feel like I'm quite good at doing stuff in response to extreme situations and extreme measures. So like if I'm immersed in I don't know, if I'm in Brazil surrounded by Brazilians in an extreme situation, I'll thrive. If I am like suffering from major stress and need to just need to sort myself out, I'll do it. But when I'm in my kind of nice regular life comfort zone, everything's ticking along quite nicely, I'm not very good at taking myself out of that comfort zone and doing things which I don't feel like doing for the sake of building up new habits, such as the kind of 9 a.m. on a Saturday studying, such as kind of regular daily meditation, even when I don't feel like it. That's something I want to get better at. And I was really inspired by a post I saw from Scott Young earlier on this year, when he said one of his goals for 2020 was to progressively increase his capacity to do hard things. Yeah. When I heard that, I thought, man, right there, that is the key. That is a huge secret right there. If you can gradually just get better at doing difficult or uncomfortable things, how much better would your life be? How much more would you read in the evenings? How much more would you resist eating, crap that you shouldn't be eating? How much more language study would you fit in on a regular basis, even though you don't feel like it? I mean, that's something I'm thinking a lot about, and not necessarily succeeding, but wanting to.
Yeah. Well, I guess with your Chinese characters thing, it's like I was studying French and Swedish at the same time for quite a while, with okay results because I was doing so much, and because they're both fairly easy, let's be honest. But I realized that my motivation to just learn Swedish to a high level was higher. And now I'm thinking about it like because of something else in my life. And this is a concept that I have vaguely referred to before as holistic language learning, where this like, okay, does learning Chinese characters actually add anything to your life right now? And probably not. I'm I'm going to be bold and
You'd be
guess
correct,
because
yeah.
because
other than the sort of satisfaction of being able to pick stuff up and read it, but like whatever, I don't need to do that. It would just be a kind of nice to have. You know?
So you would have to be really into like Chinese literature or something like that. Whereas for me, I saw value in my life in learning Swedish to a high level, not because it sounds bizarre, because as you know, most Swedes speak English to a reasonably high, if not very high level. So it's for me, it's not about speaking to Swedes necessarily. It's more about showing my followers, like people who subscribe to my channel. Followers sounds a bit pretentious, but
subscribers.
It's my subscribers that you can go from like a kind of pretty mediocre level to a high level, and I want to semi-document that process and actually, because I think that's actually harder. Say like going from B1 to C1 is harder than going from nothing to
10
B1.
10 times harder. That's something I think people don't appreciate. You know, people don't realize how hard it is to get to C1 in a language.
So, and I just sort of thought, well, my channel, my information, everything will be more valuable if I've actually done that, because I realized that although you said those things about like my thoughts on language learning and stuff, a lot of the stuff that I said in like my earlier videos is like totally wrong, or at least I wouldn't agree with it. My modern self wouldn't agree with myself back then. And I was like, if I'm going to keep doing this, I actually have to know what I'm talking about. And in order to know what I'm talking about, I have to have learned one language to a proper degree.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's room for debate on some of those terms. I mean, knowing what you're talking about is all a very relative thing. I mean, there are people, you know, so many. You know, the majority of the sort of super polyglots around the world, no one will ever know who they are. They're not on YouTube. They're just sort of just quietly going about their life learning languages, and they all learn in totally different ways. You know, I think there's a YouTube and the kind of online, again, to use that horrible term, the online polyglot world is a huge distortion of the reality of the world. You know, it's kind of, you can distill it into privileged Westerners have fun with all their free time and money and talk about it as if it's, you know, that's basically what it is. Most of the world are multilingual naturally. You know, people grow up in India, in some parts of India, speaking 3-4 languages. I mean, it's a natural state to be multilingual. People who actually learn languages themselves, they will use all kinds of different methods. Some people just read. Some people just speak. I mean, Portuguese is a language where I learned. I mean, I'm all about like stories and reading and listening and stuff these days. But I learned Portuguese just by speaking. All I did was I actually can't read Portuguese very well because the pronouns move all over the place and they're really annoying. So I didn't need to. I never bothered because I was just in Brazil just talking with people. Right? So knowing what you're talking about is very relative and very subjective. And but I think that the thing that you mentioned that is important is actually having done it yourself. Because I think the reason that I can get away with talking, the reason I feel that I can get away with talking from some degree of authority is not just because, I mean, so I've got a long background in teaching, and that gives me a framework with which to talk about languages. But I feel that itself doesn't mean anything without actually having learnt languages. And this is part of the kind of the arrogance of the online, not online, of the teaching world, the hypocrisy of the teaching world, which is that people are all, you know, English teachers. I mean, I'm going to pick on English teachers since, you know, because it's the most prevalent form of, you know, teaching people how to learn, teaching people languages. You know, you pick your average English teacher and say, well, okay, you're teaching people how to learn, you know, B2 English grammar. Have you learned the grammar of any? Can you speak any other language? And almost always the answer is no. And so I do think that however you do it, whatever method you use, that you have got to a high level in a language is a necessary thing in order to be able to talk about it. But you can do what you're sort of suggesting, which is not necessarily, because my thing is usually I'll tend to kind of talk from a position of having done something,
Yeah.
But that's only one way to do it. The other way of doing it is to actually document it as you do it, which is kind of what you're describing, and that's really cool. I think that's why people like following language language projects and things, because they get to see that development, which is something maybe we could talk about, because let me ask you what you think about this, because I'm curious. So I have been thinking recently about doing another language project. I'm not particularly motivated to learn another language right now, but I kind of got a bit of an itch that I want to scratch, and and then I started thinking to myself, well, it would be useful for people who follow my stuff to actually see, okay, how does he go about learning a language from scratch again? Like, follow along, document it. I've done it a bunch of times before. But then I started doubting myself a bit and thinking, Olly learns a language. That's not really helping anybody. That's just kind of voyeurism, and it actually doesn't really mean anything, because the fact that I might do something a certain way has no bearing on the fact of how you should do it. So it could be motivational, I guess, but I don't know. I've this thing of kind of documenting a language project week after week after week. It's starting to seem more and more artificial to me, because progress is not something. And even learning is not something that happens on that regular clockwork basis, And the more meaningful documentation of a language project would be on a multi-year basis. So how do you feel about when you see these language projects documented? And
I think this sort of crosses over into the world of YouTubers or online influencers or whatever in general. YouTube's the one that I'm most interested in, and therefore that's the one I know about. But I think a lot of YouTubers don't understand that, no one cares about you. It sounds harsh that way, but unless you're an extremely charismatic person, people, even though it feels like they're clicking for you, initially at least, they're clicking for the whatever you can give them. So I feel like if it's just, Olly learns Chinese or whatever it is, then that doesn't really that you're right. Point. That doesn't no point. Yeah, but you can make that. At least I think it can be done. I'm trying to do it. You can make that both interesting to the viewer and useful to them. So we're talking about okay, so when you guys do this, you might want to consider doing it this way or this way or this way. And you're right, people have different ways that they like to learn. So these days I try to do less talking about why I'm doing this, therefore you should do it too. But more just well, I'm motivated by this thing. I guess you can find out what your motivation is. The other thing is that, and this is sort of, I'm going to kind of give away I'm not going to say the secret to my channel, because it's not necessarily particularly successful yet, but I feel like it can be successful. I feel like we don't see enough language learners taking risks in terms of what's going to work for them, and sort of making almost a bit of a drama out of their journey to learn a language, which I know when I say it like that, it sounds even more artificial, but I have I'm trying to say that I have no what's the word? I have no guarantee that I can get to a certain level in Swedish. That is just I'm assuming that if I keep doing these things, I can do it. But on some days it feels like I've stayed at the same level for a year now. And like you said, it really channels should really not channels. Language learners and their progress would happen over years rather than months. But that's not as sexy as this idea of
right. So this is something that kind of weighs in on this consideration for me, because I'm if I was going to pick like one language project that I would really just like to put to bed for once and for all, it would be Chinese characters, right? Mostly for Japanese, because my Japanese is pretty good, but the thing that I can't do very well, which I'd like to do better, would be just effortlessly reading anything really in Japanese to a native level or native like level. And so if I was going to do something that's purely for me, and I'm also in these projects trying to think about stuff for me as well, because I've spent so many years now doing stuff for the internet that I'd actually quite like to do something for myself. And that thing would be Japanese, either in terms of Chinese characters or else, kind of more advanced level stuff. But that's not something you can document, because that's such a long-term, slow project. I'd be talking about what I'm doing without being able to actually show any results for in any meaningful time frame. So I kind of I don't know. I was thinking about learning Czech, actually. I don't know why, no particular reason, but I guess the reason that I thought about the doing a beginner project is because you can of all the stages in a language learning project, you can actually you can show progress in a fairly short time frame.
Yeah.
I did this Italian project a couple of years ago, and I within 3 months I could clearly demonstrate 0 or close to 0 to fairly conversational within that time frame, and that's a fairly easy language, but nevertheless it's possible to actually get some closure on a project like that and actually demonstrate something meaningful. But again, that's very inauthentic, because that's like, well, what's going to work on YouTube, as opposed to what do I actually want to do, or what's actually useful for people. And I don't know anymore. I find myself more and more confused over time, like what's actually kind of useful for people. And I think that's why I just tend to spend most of my time now actually just making materials for people, because that's actually useful. You can actually you can take one of my books and read it. You don't have to listen to me waffling on. You can just actually just get on with using the stuff I make. So
Actually, I have a question for you about that.
Sure.
So I read your 101 conversations in intermediate French, and it seemed like you, and I'm guessing your French, like the people you work with to make sure the French is all good and everything, knew, like, you really knew exactly, at least, like, it shouldn't have been called, for me, it shouldn't have been called intermediate French. It should have been called for Lamont's level of French.
Yeah.
Because I could read the chapters almost, like, I understood almost everything, and the bits that I didn't understand were listed at the end.
Yeah.
It's like you knew exactly what I was not going to understand. Yeah. There were a couple that I was like, okay, they didn't list that one and I don't understand it. And there were quite a few that I was like, yeah, I do know what that means. But it still seemed amazing to me that there were only like 3 things that I had to actually look up. So my question is, like, how did you guys come up with what you needed to list?
Yeah, good question. So I'm just wondering how many trade secrets I can give away here, but.
Oh yeah, no, that's okay. It's trade secrets.
No, but it's fairly straightforward. I mean, so I've been doing this for quite some time now, like creating courses and books and stuff. And the first thing to say is I've kind of gone through a process of releasing stuff that was totally below standard, full of errors, and not, I've learned the hard way. I've learned from my mistakes.
Yeah.
We've developed a process now for all the material that we create, which is very robust. Touch wood, I'd like to think it's very robust. I mean, publishing houses will still do 4 or 5 rounds of proofreading on material before it goes out. We're not at the 5 level yet, but I mean, there comes a point where it just gets very expensive. You're paying $1,000 to catch 1 comma that's in the wrong place. But the process that I like to go through with this, and I think this is the advantage of actually having spent years actually working with language learners and having this mass interaction online with people. What I've realized is that the person that you get to do the the person you get to work on different parts of the book is absolutely critical. It all comes down to the talent that you use. So, for example, it starts off with writers, because I mean my names are on the books, but I don't write them myself anymore. Yeah. Obviously, because all these different languages and stuff, and so the kind of we start off with a writer who is not only a great writer and creative, but also has experience with the teaching world, so that they can actually write to a specified level, for example, A2 to B1 or B1 to B2. So we're already starting off in the right ballpark linguistically. But then what we'll do is we'll have non-native speakers who have already learnt the language go through the material and then give suggestions for grading it appropriately.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that if you are, let's take French. If you are a native French speaker, and your task is to make sure that, let's take the word lists, the definitions, for example, that we give.
Yeah.
You're not going to know, as a native French speaker, from a native English perspective, which words are confusing or not. You might know kind of theoretically or based on some kind of corpus which words belong in a B1 or B2 category. But the advantage of having a non-native speaker who has already learnt the language doing it is that they can go through and say, oh, I remember when I learned French, I really struggled with this particular word.
Yeah.
So let's make sure that this is glossed in the word list. And also this word here, actually this is a cognate in English, so we don't need to include this because although it's a difficult word, it's guessable. So we'll have multiple rounds of different people actually going through the work and then looking at it from the perspective of the experienced learner. And so we end up with something that's not only at just the right level, because those people will also give suggestions on rephrasing certain sentences or paragraphs or whatever to make them more appropriate to the level. So we end up with something that's not only very creative and fun to read, not only at the perfect level, hopefully, but also that's kind of glossed in a way which is just right for the person because it's being looked at from the perspective of a native speaker and also an ex-learner. And then we put that process through everything we do, from courses to books and things like that, and then obviously multiple rounds of proofreading to make sure we catch errors and stuff, and even of course some still slip through inevitably. So that's how we do it. But it took us quite some time to get there, because that's not how we did it at first. But we kind of realised for some of the earlier books we did, we'd realised that we'd hear the occasional comment from people like, "Oh, well, you've given a definition of this word, but that's obvious to an English speaker because it's a cognate." And we're like, "Yeah, how can we fix that?" So we kind of developed these processes to try to get that as helpful as possible.
Yeah. No. Well, it's definitely shown, because that. It was good. I'm not sure quite how I ended up on that. I think, you said you were talking about stories. No.
Yeah, I was saying I find it more useful to spend my time creating material and stuff these days than actually doing more kind of filming language projects and things like that.
Yeah. Well,
there is a role for inspiration, though, I think, because a lot of people, when they start learning language, there is a tendency to believe that you can't do it. And so I have noticed that while the kind of language mission type thing can be a very sort of self-serving thing, there are a lot of people for whom actually seeing someone go through the process is really, really eye-opening, because it shatters a lot of false beliefs around how languages are learned and how long it should take and things like that. So I think there is a role for that for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was just saying to my wife yesterday that I discovered that the online book platform that I use, like the one I subscribe to so that I can obtain books, particularly in Swedish, has the Millennium Trilogy, the Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy. And I saw it, and then I went and looked up how much the audiobook was, and it then occurred to me that I remember a time that feels like decades ago now, but actually it wasn't that long ago, when someone suggested to me that I should read those books in Swedish. Because, you know, like non-language learners, they tend to have this idea that like you either know nothing or you're like completely fluent.
Yeah.
And they don't realize how hard reading a book that's like this big would be. Even for me today, that would be quite hard. But I remember them suggesting that, and me just kind of laughing and having this, like, there's no way I'm ever reading Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy. Like, you know, that would be a tough read in English. Not because it's hard, but because it's just so big. And just not see, like, at that time, I couldn't see the path to fluency.
Yeah.
Like, I couldn't see that path at all. So I thought it didn't exist. I was like, I'm only doing this until a certain level. And I just assumed that that level had a ceiling that was not that high. Because at the time, I could barely read, like, an email or, you know, a letter. An italki teacher would write to me in Swedish saying, like, oh, can we move the time an hour back or something? And I would struggle just to read that.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, because I think one of the things that shaped my language experience is that I got to a very good level in my first language fairly early on. And so I've always had that. I've never had any doubt that foreign languages are totally learnable. So it's interesting for me to hear that, because it just makes me wonder how many other people hold this belief for quite some time that there is actually a ceiling beyond which you can't get through. Has that changed at all for you? Has that ceiling shifted?
Well, absolutely.
Presumably you see the light at the end of the tunnel now.
Well, that's what I was about to say, that like now, if I wanted to, I could actually read Stieg Larsson. Oh, awesome. It would be hard, but like I read a lot of stuff now which I don't understand every word of, but I understand enough of that it's very clear what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm not translating back. I can have the audiobook on and just be like, oh, that's interesting that they're doing that. Oh, I didn't see that coming. Kind of like it's almost like listening to a book in English, only I'm not seeing every little nuance and everything. So that's why I was telling my wife, I was like, it just occurred to me that I could actually read Stieg Larsson, which kind of blows my mind, because I remember a time where that was just a laughable idea. What's interesting about do I now think there's a ceiling? I think there probably is. I think there's a practical ceiling. That is to say, there's a level for some learners in some languages where you could theoretically move beyond that level, but it would take so much work that there is just no circumstance in this life that would make it worthwhile, kind of thing. Like, like you take Matt's Japanese, for example. Okay, he would get better if he lived in Japan, and he might get better for 2 years. But probably not heaps noticeably better. He would probably feel more comfortable in various scenarios. But after that, okay, maybe he could get better in like super specific things, but like he would have to put in twice the work that he's already put in, which is substantial, and it wouldn't really make any practical difference. So I think there is a level, like you hear Europeans, as in non-English speaking Europeans, who have lived in London or Sydney or something for like a long time, and they still make this one error that it's like, okay, you could train that error out of yourself if you really wanted, but is there really any point? It's actually kind of cute almost that you always say that. Like,
well, yeah, you don't want to totally erase your personality or your heritage, or that's what makes it endearing to be a second language speaker. But yeah, I think that question of, can you become indistinguishable from a native speaker is the kind of question that I think you stop worrying about once you've got too close to that level, because what happens then is you've actually experienced you've had the experience of being able to live life with a language to a very high level, and knowing that that's perfect, that's enough, you know.
Yeah.
Like, none of my languages am I indistinguishable from a native speaker, far from it. But there's a number where I can live my life perfectly well in that language, have friends who are just as close as they would be if they were in English, and then you just, the notion of needing to get progressively better is just becomes absurd, because there's just no, like you say, there's no point. So I think that's one of like many kind of theoretical questions that people ask when they kind of get into the whole language learning thing, which is really a kind of an unnecessary question.
Well, I think too many people at the beginning frame it as, can I learn the language or can't I? Which is like, well, of course you can learn. If I can tell you one word and you remember that word, then you've learned that. So by definition, you speak a little bit of that language. And I think I kind of saw it that way with Swedish in the beginning. Obviously, I knew that there was like going to be a level of progress, but I think the question that I really had inside my head was, can I get good enough at Swedish that I could actually have the conversation without thinking through English? Because back then that was like the highest I'd ever gotten, was being able to translate in German. Like, I could speak German by just translating. So I was like, will I ever be able to think in Swedish? And can I do that before I lose interest in it and start on something else? Because that was the pattern of my teenage years and my 20s, was like, I would get really, really into something just to the point that it started being useful, and then I would become interested in something else. So
it's interesting you say that was a teenage thing, because I'm finding that's what's happening to me now. It's super frustrating.
Well, I guess it's not so bad if you've kind of built up your own employment, or whatever. If you've got, like, say, a steady job, or you've got your own thing going on that is self-sufficient, or
it all depends on the context, doesn't it? But I think that thing of there's a lot of things in life, I think, where having been through something once just changes your fundamental perspective on it, and you'll never look at things again in the same way. It's like in business, a lot of people say, like, until you've gone through bankruptcy, you can never be a true entrepreneur, because there's a degree of confidence that comes through having gone through bankruptcy, losing everything, and then realizing that you can do it all over again. That gives you a degree of confidence that is necessary to do sort of, Richard Branson level stuff. And I wonder how many other things that applies to as well. What if you've worked your way up to a 6-pack, at some point in your life, then you can do it again. And there's a switch that you can flick, in theory, that can get you to start implementing those behaviors that will get you back to where you need to be.
I think it can work. It can work against you in language learning. Like, I remember when I sort of took just a very brief look at, like, a new language not that long ago, not because I wanted to learn it, but just that feeling of, like, I understand nothing in this, and then thinking back through the years of my Swedish, just going like, am I ever going to actually be able to do that again? Whereas, like, with Swedish, I didn't really care, because I didn't think it would go that far. So it was always just a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. Whereas when I looked at this new language, I was like, I don't know if I'm up for this, like, doing the same thing. I
missed that. I missed the sort of romance of the early stages of a new language. The excitement and the kind of just wide-eyed. I know nothing, because I always find there's a certain degree of, like, Dutch courage that comes from being a total beginner in a language, and that you don't care if you make a fool out of yourself or make mistakes, because you don't expect anything. You have no higher expectations. Whereas the thing that always scuppers me is, as soon as I get to a reasonable level in a language, I kind of switch from, it's fine to make mistakes because I don't know this language anyway, to, right, I know this language now, so I'm going to look like a fool if I make any mistakes, and that sort of really my confidence takes a knock. And I've always had that problem, that mental block with a new language. And I think that's why I'm such a fan of language exchanges, because it kind of just gives you the ability to just push your way through that barrier by just talking a lot with people.
It is. I like, come to think of it, that is the case, in that, like, that's I feel like that's why this is why I feel like my Swedish is never getting any better, because I'm just, it just means that I'm aware of smaller and smaller mistakes, and I'm always trying to say more and more complicated things. That I actually feel as lost as I did 3 years ago. It's just that 3 years ago I was saying much more simple things and was equally lost. But these days I'm saying much more complicated things, but I still have that same feeling of like, I have no idea what's going on here.
Well, it's like, it's a combination of heightened awareness and also, you kind of, I've heard it described before as, I think the stage you're referring to is a bit like when you feel like you should be better than you are, but you kind of realize that you just talk like a not very intelligent teen, at that level. Yes. And so you're kind of, socially, that's actually quite debilitating, because you go and talk to an adult of your age, but then you realize you're talking with the intelligence of a 13-year-old or something, and that's quite an uncomfortable place socially to be, and requires quite a lot of stubbornness to push through. And I do occasionally relish the opportunity to speak English in front of people that I've only ever spoken another language in front of. I do occasionally go like, see, now they'll know I'm not an idiot. It's just the language thing. Well, listen, man, it's been great to talk. We've been at it for over an hour. I'm sure we could go on for hours to come, but for the sake of people's sanity, I think we should wrap it up. Well, we covered a lot of ground. I have to think what the title of this episode is going to be. I've got so many things to choose from, but thank you for the conversation. It's been super interesting. And where can people go to find out more about you?
Probably put Days of French and Swedish into YouTube, and if you can't remember that, just put Days of French. I'm sure it'll still come up.
Is it just the YouTube channel that you've got going on for now?
Yes, I mean, people can follow me on Instagram if they want, but like, it's not always language related stuff. Sometimes it's just like photos of my kids and stuff. Sometimes it's like, it's kind of behind the scenesy stuff sometimes. So that's why people like following people on Instagram, because they get those behind the scenes thing. So for that, it is Days_French_Swedish.
Lots of underscores. I learned that lesson when I made the worst Twitter handle in the world ever, which is Olly_IWTYAL. But it's too late to change it now, so it is what it is. It's on the back of the book now. Anyway, well, thanks, man. We'll have to have you back on for round 2 sometime. Until then.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me, Ollie. It's been great.
No, my pleasure.